Now, may I introduce the first panel, which is about growth, and it is the Lord Mayor's panel on unleashing the power of deep tech, defense, and finance. And if you'd like to come up onto the stage as I speak, that would be great. So the chair is Sir Edward Branham, chair of M&G and non-exec of the Treasury. Nadia Carlston, CEO of the Danish Center for AI Innovation, although deep down, she's a quantum baby. Always. Nick Prettyjohn, head of AI in the UK for Palantir. Bill Doby, founder and CEO at Sedna. Michael Cuthbert, director of the National Quantum Computing Center. Chris Lay, CEO of Marsh McLennan. And Hans-Henrik Knudsen, senior advisor of Partisia Quantum.
Thank you, Karina, and congratulations on pulling together such an amazing audience and such an amazing panel. Your persuasive skills are unlimited, and it is absolutely fantastic. Thank you also for doing my first job, which is introduce the panel. I'm not quite sure where this is going to go, but if it goes into a free-flowing conversation, then that will be really good. We thought we would try and get a little bit of structure into it by thinking in terms of crossover, what it is, the speed of it, controls, precision problems, disinformation, how does all that work in a crossover environment. Given where we are on the hype curve, we thought we'd spend maybe a little bit more time on what I think of as delivery, actually making things happen, than on some of the other items. There's an awful lot under that heading. And then we'll spend some time on how to think about some of the risks at the end of it. Now, I have a magic tablet, which if everything works, will let me see questions. And if you, even if you're in the room, if you use that, I can then weave it into the conversation as we go, and maybe we stop for a bit for questions, maybe we don't. And then I'm going to finish with giving everyone a last say of the thing, they having heard all the conversation, that they would like to leave behind. So we haven't had very long to get ourselves organized, but Nick from Palantir kindly offered to kickstart the conversation on crossover.
Thank you. So I guess we're living in interesting times. There is an incredible pace of innovation and development. A lot of this, of course, is brought about through necessity. We've seen how conflict in Europe has brought about the need to be able to innovate and ultimately not just come up with ideas in academia or in a lab, but actually test them literally on the battlefield to see how you can improve your lethality, improve your survivability. And ultimately, this is a culture that, of course, has brought about incredible innovations where it comes into air defenses, where it comes into a number of different technology stacks, particularly in artificial intelligence. And because it's out of necessity, as people innovate in the defense tech ecosystem, they go out to Ukraine because, of course, what better evidence that your technology is working than by going out to the battlefield and testing whether it works. And this, of course, while the Ukrainian government is, while keen to encourage, what I think is found really, I think what a lot of us can learn from it in the private sector is how discerning they are. They do not have time for time wasters. If you bring technology to the battlefield and it doesn't perform, if it's subject to electronic warfare and it doesn't maintain or improve their lethality, if it is not able to ultimately increase the survivability of that nation, they don't want you wasting their time. They want to be spending time with others. And I spend a lot of time working with private sector organizations on AI adoption. And there, as there were with previous technologies before, there is a great degree of skepticism, I think well earned, to be honest, that technology can actually transform how their businesses work. The challenge is that there is, I think, from executives, boards, is this sort of, well, the previous thing didn't work, so maybe this won't work either, therefore I'll spend my time worrying about more important matters. And of course, it never will work if that's your attitude. And so didn't work, so maybe this won't work either, therefore I'll spend my time worrying about more important matters. And of course, it never will work if that's your attitude. And so what we see particularly is not the grasping of the nettle that is required. Ultimately, boards sitting down with their CTOs and CIOs and holding them to account and demanding the performance to be improved, essentially to actually see it in the fundamentals of the business. Because, much as we can learn from Ukrainians, like if you're not improving their fundamental fighting power, you've just got a neat tech demo with a pretty drone. Well, they don't have time for that, and you shouldn't have time for the equivalent in your settings.
Thank you. Bill, you've been in a lot of different places. How do you see things?
It was interesting, actually, to the point that you're making about the urgency for the Ukrainians that this actually work. And it is a kind of, we're not in defense, but in logistics, and there's the same sort of, there's almost no fault tolerance for failure. And I will say it's kind of interesting because you've referenced the hype cycle a couple times. And one of the things I'm personally cautious about, this technology is really transformational. There are obviously previous hype curves and magic things, that are going to fix all of our problems. But what's happening in AI is so tangible that you have to kind of put out the noise of the hype cycle a bit, and you actually have to keep focusing on the practical outcome that you can get at it. I actually think the UK is a good place for that. I'm an immigrant to the UK and have made it my home. It's for its many for the challenges that the British like to lecture themselves about. They forget how practical the country is as a whole in getting down to it and getting it done. So we kind of find this a very good test bed, both to hire people to actually genuinely take what can be quite abstract technologies and actually find very practical uses for them. And that's where we're seeing a lot of the crossover. I'll also say, and I think it's relevant to the growth, this is one of the few technological waves where everybody is using the tech. It's highly unlikely that anybody here hasn't touched GPT, ChatGPT, or Claude, or Mistral, Perplexity, or all these different tools. So it's rare when we in the enterprise, defense, or industrial sectors are actually working on something, building something, trying to sell something, and then simultaneously everyone else is becoming an expert who has a sense of how meaningful it is. So I think there's a nice perfect storm for practical outcomes to growth from our point of view. So
Very interesting. Can I just tap into that ecosystem point? Can you just flesh out, and maybe some others want to jump in, at a really practical level? How does, for instance, regulation make a difference between doing stuff here, doing things elsewhere, all the other things should go into ecosystem? By all means, you start and it looks like.
I'm not a regulatory expert, so I think I have to preface it with that. As a business owner, as someone who consumes capital to build growth, what I want is certainty. I want to have confidence the government can solve problems, the basic problems in functioning well, and then we can have certainty in how we hire, how we build, how we deploy capital. I think that's really where the regulatory framework can best serve the growth we need. I do think there are privacy, significant privacy implications and other things that must be worked through, but the tone has to be set of competence, and regulations, I think, flow from that in my personal view. I think there's probably more experts in this.
I'm happy to come in on that. I'm not from the technology sector. I'm from the financial services and professional services sector, and at Marsh McLennan, I'm about to become chair of the London Market Group for the insurance industry in the UK. There's a great opportunity for us to unleash the power when you think about the industry I'm in, with 32% of the GDP of the City of London, big employer, 160 billion of premium, and therefore a lot of data that we're trying to find better ways to use and to deliver better and faster decision-making tools to clients. I think when you get to the risk lens, and regulatory issues are definitely ones we have to consider very carefully, because we in our industry are often being asked, can you evidence how you got to that decision? and the integrity of that. And so the blending of the sort of the better use of data with human interaction is super important. And that's a big collaborative discussion to have, because I don't think we've really figured that out at the moment. We are risk cautious, I would say, rather than risk advancing, because we worry about the regulatory environment we've come from rather than the one that we're perhaps heading to around competitiveness. But also just maybe picking up on the point about making sure that industry drives forward on this really exciting agenda for us. We do have to think about the practical use cases. So what are the real life issues that are in the boardroom rather than just the learning journeys we're on? And I was thinking about this before the summit here, that supply chain has been a big conversation point for most people this year in the last 12 months, geopolitical issues and so on. And most organizations have an army of people trying to understand their supply chains, and they're asking their tier one suppliers, and then they're saying to their tier one suppliers, what do you know? And it usually stops around about tier two if they've done a good job. But of course, we do know the data's out there. So how do we use our tools in AI and to some extent quantum emerging to get to that? And we developed a tool that we launched in the last 12 months called Centrisk that uses global trade data, shipping data, and various movement data, so we can see if somebody gives us a tier one supply locations list, you can immediately see what's come into that location. But not only that, the route it traveled, the ports it went to, and then you can start throwing simulations using other data systems and using AI and some degree quantum to throw climate simulations, geopolitical simulations, and this is something highly valuable to the public sector, to industry, to our clients more generally. But other areas that perhaps are just struggling to show evidence are not getting so much traction. So I think it's focusing on those things, and then making sure that in the chain we can show evidence as to how we get to the decisions and not get caught up with the regulatory challenge in the process.
Interesting. Can we just spend, before we move on from this, a moment or two on what I think of as precision? So that's a combination of the challenges of data accuracy and the risk of collateral damage. I don't know who wants to pick that up. Nick, you're
I can give it a go.
Excellent.
But yeah, so we do a piece of work with the National Health Service where we have built a solution that uses artificial intelligence to draft discharge summaries. So if you're unlucky enough to go to hospital and you want to get out again, you'll need this discharge letter. And that goes to you, it goes to your GP, and it pretty much just summarizes your experience in hospital, and it will include recommendations such as medication to take. So the challenge there around integrity, and actually builds off the sort of regulatory point, is that that document has to be accurate. Because if it's inaccurate, if it recommends, say, it hallucinates an extra 0 onto your dosage, well, then you could have quite an unfortunate experience. And so when we think about this, how do we start to integrate the regulatory framework that already exists for medical devices? How do we integrate ultimately the accuracy principles that need to be approached to any sort of documentation that's produced in a hospital, whether by a human or by software? What's nice is that there are already the risk sort of frameworks for this. Like, we understand how we need to do risk management. We itemize all of the areas where we know sort of risk can approach. We understand what our mitigations might be, and then we look at our residual risks, and we eventually evaluate with clinicians whether that's acceptable. And so this has been, very, very interesting. Because of course, there's areas, for example, on this dosage, you just cannot afford to mess that up. So you don't use the AI for that bit. You build a system that leans in and dials up the use of artificial intelligence technologies where it's appropriate, and you don't use it where it's inappropriate, and it creates, unaffordable risk. And so this has been particularly interesting because by starting with the outcome of this document needs to be accurate, but we recognize that reducing the time to prepare it and also making it a an asynchronous task. So it's something that happens while the doctor's doing their rounds versus the doctor having to sit down at the computer for 20 minutes to write up. So it's ready for them when they get to it. So less time with doing paperwork, more time doing surgeries. Is that like when you work with this sort of domain, it actually gets quite easy because while the work is hard, you know what the bar is. And the challenge you find is that if you start talking about integrity and risks and things like this without a clear outcome, you just start with the inputs. Well, you could sit in a room and throw risks on a board for days, right? And you wouldn't have itemized all possible risks. You need the use case, you need the outcome to constrain your thinking to what's relevant, what's practical, and also to therefore inform your development to make sure that it's proportionate to what you're trying to achieve.
Can I add to that? Because I think we have a slightly different perspective on that from an even more fundamental level on how important the data aspect is, the data security aspect is, because the reason we exist, the Danish Center for AI Innovation, was this, I think, not particularly groundbreaking notion, to be honest, that AI is a very important thing on a national level, and that countries have to be able to manage their data, do something out of their data in a way that doesn't trade off the security of the data in order to do AI. And it's a simple notion, but actually quite harder to execute than you would think. And so some of the verticals that we focus on are the ones that really cannot afford to let their data out of the country. So finance, financial services, health data, anybody that uses sensitive patient data especially. Defense is another one. And the interesting part is all of those three sectors could greatly benefit from doing more AI. They want to do more AI, and they had no way to do it on any sort of massive scale before we existed. And so that was the problem. And of course, the execution then, to your point, has to do with how do you get that trust into the system at every layer of the stack. This is something that every country, including the UK, is wrestling with. This is something that's incredibly important at the international level because we have to balance this issue of doing AI at large scales, maintaining data sovereignty without creating these closed systems that also close off international collaboration. So I think when we think about crossover systems, this is also really important to think about, not just in terms of the software layer, but also the entire infrastructure that is enabling the software to be developed in the first place, and that is enabling regulated industries and other companies and users that have sensitive needs to also benefit from quantum and AI.
Okay, I'm going to go down the other end of the line. Yes, exactly where I was coming.
Okay, I was just going to come in on that because I wonder, I mean, it's about the right tool for the right job, I think. So, quantum computing potentially for sparse data sets, not for big data, not for data-rich problems. But I think there's a question mark about accreditation of data, particularly for the sort of applications that we're talking about in healthcare, as an example, where perhaps the early experience of many people using some of the AI tools over the internet has been hallucination and other data issues associated with the learning set coming from the internet, rather than the learning set coming from an accredited specialist data set. And there's therefore a question mark of how do we get across to patients that it is a trusted data set and not something that they could expose themselves to by using ChatGPT on the internet. And that, I think, is a real challenge for healthcare professionals as much as the kind of technology sector.
I guess it's AI fatigue is definitely going to be setting in with some folks. They've experienced it going wrong. And ultimately, there's a few different schools of thought on this, but what is particularly interesting is that, when you think about any sort of medicine, there's lots of ways that you can learn, in which case what different sort of drugs combined in such different sort of treatment pathways can create a certain outcome. The way you measure whether it's effective, whether it's dangerous, isn't by looking at sort of the particular name of chemicals that goes into it. You look at what is the impact of this on patients. And so ultimately, when we think about artificial intelligence, you need to de-risk any sort of risk from data poisoning going in, because the best models, you have no control on the data going in. You must control it through the outputs. And so if you think about this as that, if at the end of the day I don't want this model to be able to do dangerous things, don't put it in a position where it can, no matter the inputs, no matter what it's trained on. Because the alternative, well, one, it's very hard to sort of have these like totally clean data sets. And two, the entire architecture of these models is token generation through sort of this inference that it runs, right? Deep within those layers, it's just guessing at the next token. There's no guarantee that with perfect data that will generate something that isn't a lethal recommendation, right? It's just token prediction. So you need to actually measure it on the output to make sure through deterministic matters that you are not going to be using this in a way that causes harm.
Hans, can I bring you in? So you're in the heart of the security side of this. You're listening to this conversation. What's going through your head?
So I think it's an extremely exciting space, and I think it's an extremely exciting topic. And there's a whole category of risks around this that we also need to grapple with. And one is, of course, whether you can trust what's coming out of an AI or not. And the other is, as we grow more dependent on data flows and exchange more secure or more sensitive data in financial services or in healthcare, how do we ensure the security of this data, both when it's in transit and when it's in rest? And I think all of us here know that quantum computers will enable the traditional encryption schemes to eventually break down. And so securing that is now a mandate in the EU for the financial services sector. It will become a worldwide mandate, I'm sure, across industries, because you need to document that you are truly protecting this. And so the mandate in the union is by 30, that's 5 years. That's a relatively short time horizon for large corporations to move stuff in IT. And I think that is something that is closely approaching, and where we need to think closely about how do we think about that aspect? So grasping, of course, all the opportunities that are there with all of these new technologies, but at the same time ensuring that we're not exposing ourselves to new risks or just not managing the existing risks we've already identified.
Yeah, go on.
No, it's quite interesting, because I think there is the very sound philosophical approach about governance. Who owns the data, right? It's my data. And then you're making what I think is the first point that one might make. Well, if it's clean enough, it will be accurate. Then you're reminding us, actually, that's not how they work. It's going to make stuff up anyways, because of the nature of the tokens, how tokens are generated and the next words are generated. For me, what I'm experiencing, and I'm curious about the group here, all of these things are fairly well known on some level, and also we've all experienced the errors in the models themselves. What astonishes me is the risk that people and companies will continue to take. So, we have been selling into very conservative industries for a decade now. I mean, we couldn't do some of the most basic technological things. Now we're in these meetings, and when they tell us what they're doing with AI, I'm like, are you nuts? You're just shoving all your information into and same at home, right? People, I think to your point about the healthcare outcomes, for sure, I think even my partner's had a bad experience with loading something up to ChatGPT, but the next day he loads up the next thing to ChatGPT. And I'm kind of astonished at where is that need coming from? There's obviously something about the institutions, the systems, the technology that are sold today that aren't meeting people's expectations, and they're willing to tolerate such a high level of risk. And then you have quantum barreling down on this, which is actually going to make it all the more precise. And I'm curious if anyone's had any views why, despite what we know are a number of issues that are deeply unresolved, are very big enterprises and individuals pushing the risk curve so much?
So for us, what we see is actually a little bit more nuanced than what you're seeing, because large enterprises don't necessarily adopt AI very deeply into the organization.
Their people might, though.
Not really, not to the extent that you would think. And I'm talking really large organizations that we're working with across Europe. There's usually a dual track of things happening within any large organization with AI. There's a public-facing track where they are shoving a lot of data into ChatGPT or other things. And yes, in some cases, you're like, why are you doing that? Yeah. But the point of doing that is Sometimes to enable the employees, who to your point would be doing that anyway. Sometimes it's to have a publicly facing AI initiative that serves the customers, think the chatbots that pop up when you're trying to log into your bank and things like that. Sometimes it's actually beneficial. So I know some of the pharma companies we work with are working with digital assistants to help track to help the patients track whether they're taking their medicines on time, things like that. Super useful. But all of that is they are in a position of being a user of existing models. They are in a position of being a consumer of AI. With the large enterprises that we work with, and this is the track that we care about more, is enterprises developing their own AI. In some cases, it's brand new models based on new data. So we work in the pharma industry quite considerably. So these are companies that are developing genomics foundational models. These are companies that are developing new ways to take sometimes quantum-generated physics models and do AI based on that. But the point is they're not simply a consumer of AI. They are actually part of the innovation development community of AI. And in that sense, I think we have to think about the risk appetite for those two tracks very differently. And of course, one of those tracks is usually more confidential and more proprietary than the other one. So the takeaway would be we can't judge what large enterprises are doing based on the press releases and what we publicly see is happening in AI right now. Same thing with quantum, actually, to be honest. The companies that are actually doing useful things with quantum are usually not the ones generating a PR every single week about quantum.
Yeah, and I think it's also important that we know that great risk management relies a lot on actually having a speak-up policy that talks about the things that have gone wrong as well as the things that have gone right, and playing those back into your organization. So, for example, in our world, we started with a base case in ChatGPT some years ago that said, how difficult is it to insure an offshore wind farm? And we could show our colleagues the example, and then we could show them the things that were missing that we know from our own experience, and having those continually evolve. In our own large language model in Marsh McLennan LenAI, every time we release an update, which is frequent, you have to do a test before you can access it. So all the time we're trying to get people to think about the risks which are growing and evolving. But if you go into ChatGPT, there's never a test. And so organizations, I think, have to use their own risk frameworks to get across the line as things develop, because it's super exciting and helpful, but and also you understand the optimum intersections between advice and data output.
This conversation is quite interesting. So within M&G, when we start a conversation, we very often start by talking about risks. And the reason for doing that is you wind up exactly what we've got here, is that there's a sort of risk undercurrent to almost everything you're saying. And someone put it to me the other day that when everyone can do AI, what's your competitive advantage? And coming from where they were, their answer to that question was the exclusivity of your data. I would add your people on top of that, but the exclusivity of your data. And if we're giving it all the way up front, you're not positioning yourself terribly well for the long term. Should we sort of move on focus a little bit? Where are people seeing the real practical bottom line benefits of this? I don't know. Should we start the other end of the line?
So I think coming from the security, that benefits is things not happening, right? So it's a harder thing to measure than maybe than in other areas. But I do think that if you're using an iPhone today, your messages are post-quantum encrypted, as it's called. It means they're secure when a quantum computer comes online. So slowly the industry is adapting. And I think the fact that we have these NIST in the US has published algorithms that are quantum secure, and they are there for you to use in your organizations today, or for you to require your vendors to use. So that's a good starting point, I think, for something that at least serves the intermediate until we get proper quantum encryption, which is what Partisia Quantum, the company I'm here with today, actually does, is making quantum encryption useful. And then at that point, we are at a point where the physics in itself is securing the data, and making sure that no matter what happens on the mathematics side, which normal encryption requires some mathematics or is based on mathematics that we believe to be hard to solve, but maybe a genius will come along and solve it, and then we are exposed. Once we get quantum encryption online, we will be protected by physics. So that is sort of the ultimate goal, and what we're trying to push into reality with great speed is actually securing the world's data in every context by physics. And so that actual benefit we're still a tiny bit away from, but we're actually much closer on benefits on the quantum encryption side than many of the quantum computing benefits, because the computers are still lacking in scale, whereas we have the hardware for many of the quantum encryption things.
So I think an interesting aspect of the question was, where are you seeing bottom line benefits? And a lot of the places I go to, they talk about benefits of AI, and they talk about it in terms of how many meetings they're summarizing and things like that. And it's sort of, unless they've literally got a team of people summarizing meetings all day before that they've now replaced with AI, that's not really a bottom line benefit. And so we have some work with a company called AIG, which is a very large insurance company. And with them, they started with this outcome. They want to grow revenue. And so they said, come work with this bit of our business called Lexington Insurance. This is one of their business units. And work with the underwriters, right? That's where the revenue comes into the business. And so for Lexington Insurance, before we got there, it took them about 3 weeks to reply to a broker with any new inbound. So if your competitor, and of course the broker's contacting many insurance companies, gets to them in 2.5 weeks, well, that probably goes to the competitor. So being fast is competitive advantage. It increases your win rate. And so through the use of language models, we were able to extract meaningful information from the liability documents that are sent in by the brokers, which is normally run to about 400 pages for sort of corporate commercial insurance, in about 10 minutes, and then run them against all of the underwriting standards they've got, many of which are just deterministic and others have to be reasoned about. The net effect is they can now get back to the broker in 3 hours, not 3 weeks. So that also gives them time to essentially write a better product. Because they're not spending 3 weeks just doing the basics, they can get a higher bind ratio. They can actually improve the profitability of those contracts. They can actually be faster and be better. And the nice thing about that on the bottom line benefit is they were so confident in the results that they guided their investor community at their AGM in the spring that they expected this business unit's revenue growth rate to double. So that's one AI use case that went from signature on the pilot to production within 6 months and was guided to the market that the business unit would double its growth rate. And so the challenge that I find when I talk to people about meeting note summarization or whatever it might be is, why are you selling yourself short? Why not demand that your technology teams and your partners deliver benefits like that in 6 months? And if not, ask why.
So to spark the conversation and abuse the privilege of chair, I think we've seen that experimentation is all very well, but actually it's a waste of time. You'll get far better returns if you take something which is mission critical to you and go for it, and work with the willing by all means, but go for it. The second thing is, the thing to go for is something where memory is at a premium and you have very high volumes on it. So you've got to pick your targets. And the last thing is, don't spend too long fiddling around with the software, because it's going to change incredibly quickly. So use what's off the shelf and make it work. Does this resonate with others?
It absolutely resonates. I mean, the first one particularly is the people going out looking for risk-free, high-impact use cases to try. They're just going to look forever. There's no low-hanging fruit. Anything that is meaningful and worth doing is not going to be risk-free, and it's going to require work. And so when you do these projects, actually you have to grasp the nettle of how are we going to handle the idea like hallucination? How are we going to handle integration into our existing legacy estate? Because if it's not writing back to the existing estate, it's not going to work. If you try and maybe scope down the project so it's sort of a model project, we'll use synthetic data, we won't worry, we'll do a proof of concept, we'll do a pilot, and then you build this thing. Well, then all you have at the end is a toy. You can't put it into production because you've shaved off the bits of the problem that actually make it meaningful and help you get into production. It's like saying we're going to build a bridge and saying, well, bricks and mortar is too tricky, it's expensive, we might get it wrong, let's use Lego. At the end of it, you've got a Lego bridge. You're not going to drive a truck over it.
So can I sort of switch slightly? national infrastructure. We've got two of you who are right at the heart of that. How should we all think about the importance of it and what nationally we all need to be doing to give the businesses in our countries the best possible chance? Do you want to start, Nadia?
Yeah, sure. Happy to start before handing it off to Michael. It's critically important. I mean, everything we've talked about from the security angle to this very real problem of getting companies and users generally to go from these POCs and prototype toy problems to real problems. Getting beyond that really requires having infrastructure in your country. It does two things. It, of course, checks the boxes in terms of compliance and making sure that people feel comfortable using tools like AI and quantum without having to trade off data, without having to worry about the security of everything else they're going to build on the platform. There's also an economic level of security that comes with doing that, making sure that the builders of these new models, the owners of these data, are not going to go elsewhere once it takes off, right? You want to plan for success. But there's also the critical component, in my view, going back to the ecosystem notion. If you don't have the infrastructure in your country, it becomes really hard to build an AI or quantum ecosystem in your country. So one of the things that we've done in Denmark is not only create the infrastructure, but also make sure that it's accessible. This is another key point. There's a lot of focus on how big the national infrastructure should be and so on, but it's really about who can access that infrastructure and on what terms. And what everybody should be aiming for that is considering having a national infrastructure is ensuring that the access is not reserved for just one component of the ecosystem, and that as much as possible, everybody that's part of that ecosystem is able to access it on terms that are beneficial to them and resonate with them. Because I'm just going to take the AI example, since I know Michael will talk about quantum. When it comes to AI, one of the hurdles in building something meaningful is that the people that have the quality data or the useful data are not the same people that have the good models, who are also not the same people that have the good application areas and the means to take something from a prototype to an actual product or put it in production use, who are also not the same people that have the capital and are able to fund the enormous amount of GPU power required to do something with AI at scale. So having the ecosystem around the infrastructure to make sure that all of these people can talk to each other and collaborate all the way to something useful is absolutely critical.
That ecosystem point's really interesting. Michael, and I've got a question which says we shouldn't be talking about quantum because quantum's way down the road and AI's here. Can you pick that up as well?
So let me start off with saying quantum's here and now. So, but I should also just underscore quantum is not just quantum computing. It's also quantum sensing, networking, and at the heart of that is time and how we can ever improve our timing standards, because all of these technologies need quantum enhanced time and the delivery of time. But to go back to your point on let's say national infrastructure, I think there's a point here about government's role in building capability but not capacity. And so you can access quantum computers today through cloud services, and indeed you can access AI and high-performance compute through cloud services, and yet governments want to have exascale compute capabilities, or indeed on-premises quantum compute capabilities for government as a user, but also recognizing that actually we need to learn how to use these tools before they get deployed in a more widespread environment, certainly in the public sector. So, an example that we've been pursuing in the National Quantum Computing Centre at Harwell in Oxfordshire. So we have a testbed program that's just coming to a close in the deployment phase. So we now have 7 commercial quantum computers under one roof, different modalities, so where we can start to explore the different use cases, different applications, different algorithms that are best suited for those early prototypes so that we can improve our understanding and learn what the right informed next steps are on that pathway to large-scale quantum computing. Just to put that in context, currently you can run about a few thousand coherent operations within your calculation today on some of the state-of-the-art cloud service tools. To get to really commercial, viable computation that's genuine quantum advantage, we need to be able to run about 10 to the 12, perhaps 10 to the 14 coherent operations. So that's a factor of 10 improvement for the next decade every year. So we need to have an informed roadmap, and actually having some of that infrastructure and those platforms today helps us build the evidence case that informs us of what the next steps need to be.
That's very exciting that the UK has those kind of investments, I think. But one of the questions I have, and when we talk about national infrastructure, is like, how do we not, I guess my immediate question would be, if it wasn't in a room, I would ask you directly, like, how are we not going to be on the back foot, right? Because we when you look at the it's a bit like, now we're building data centers in the UK. Those exascale center investments were decided 2 or 3 years ago in markets that we're not in, and there's that risk of we're kind of racing to catch up. I think hard science is a different question, but I wonder, like, when we talk of national infrastructure, setting aside, I think, privacy and control, which is a different element, there's always my fear that we'll be too late to the party while China and the US and other markets are surging ahead with sort of capital and science that we can't keep up with. And then simultaneously, we have a potentially tech-hostile regulatory environment, right? Where we say, well, we don't like Google, and we don't like Facebook, and we don't like Palantir, and we don't like these, not me, by the way, but this kind of discussion gets looped on that, when really what we should be doing is leveraging the ability of people who can compete at this super scale to operate here in a compliant way. I think that's where, I think for me, the infrastructure question is too construction-oriented, I suppose, is a risk.
So to add to your point there, I think we have to differentiate between the capital requirements in scaling the hardware,
right,
certainly in quantum computing, compared to a particular strength in the UK around benchmarking and verification and quantum software and algorithm development. The value will come from the algorithms and from the applications. At the moment, the investment is going into a hardware.
How would you recommend then, if we are inventing that value, how do we crystallize it to grow here rather than having it captured by people who move faster than us outside of the UK? Sorry, that's a heavy question.
Yes. Well, I mean, that is about creating the right environment. I think there is a role for government in signposting very clearly intent and direction, because that brings in private investment where there's a clear roadmap. So the UK has a national quantum strategy. We have a 10-year roadmap to deliver that sort of value I was describing. So you can lay the foundations and set direction, but it has to crowd in private investment alongside the public investment. I don't think it's the job of government, and certainly it starts to get beyond the investment levels that governments are typically willing to make. But I think what we've seen, for example, in the US with the DARPA Quantum Benchmarking Initiative, has been a kind of seed that has really brought together, I think they have about 20 companies in that program from around the world. But those companies are not simply looking at that single program and saying, okay, let's bet the farm on that one. They're also saying, we need to invest in Europe, we need to invest in Asia, we need to ensure we have on-premises hardware in other jurisdictions and not simply put it all in the US. So there's definitely opportunities in Europe and certainly for the UK in this.
I always think too, just to finish that point, like when you think about the London strengths risk management, insurance, finance. I mean, I think one of the things we forget about is things go wrong all the time. That's why there is insurance and stuff. These are all places where the UK should be able to lead. We can experiment with all these things, and we accept that 2 out of 10 might not work. We know how to manage that risk. We know how to experiment. And that's, I think, hopefully something we can lean into.
Well, I think one of the things that our industry is also trying to work through is traditionally we've had a set of triggers that give rise to a loss and a settlement of a loss, and what are those triggers in the future, because we're working in a less physical world with a sort of set of events that's less easy to predict. But that's where I think there's a massive opportunity for us, developing more parametric scenarios where we can use different data sets to build those out. And of course, investors do want to have confidence, even to insure a very large data center today, the capital sums insured, and the modeling of that and so on. So bringing that data forward, looking at different triggers and different data sets is going to be important. And I think there is a power, if we use quantum correctly, to use more complex data to enable us to develop new products that will deliver for that in the future.
So I've been using the questions to try and steer the conversation rather than necessarily to ask the question. This is very, very specific. We've implicitly been talking about quite large organizations, even if we haven't been explicit about it. Turning the thing the other way around, SMEs, huge percentage of many of our economies, they don't have access to the same risk thinking, they don't have access to the same technology. How should they be thinking about it?
Can I jump in here? I think this is one of the critical reasons why we should have infrastructure at the national level and make sure that it's accessible. We work with everyone, from single researchers in academia to very large enterprises, but with SMEs in between and with a specific focus on startups. The startups are actually the one doing the most innovative things with AI. I mean, hands down. There's no question. They are the ones building new models. They are the ones taking existing models, refining them with very interesting data sets. They are also a very nice bridge to bring innovation into large companies. We have one example where a startup created an AI model, trained it on our computer so that they could take business transactions and help them close much faster than normal. They took that model, and now that model is deployed into one of the largest companies operating in Denmark. The large company would most likely not have been able to create that model because they don't have the expert team, they don't have the right resource allocation to do it, even though they had same access to the computer as the startup. So this unlocking the startup community is really critical for AI. We see similar things for quantum, actually.
Hans, you're right in the middle of this.
Yeah, I think this is the sort of the golden moment for startups in this space. And I was trying to think of an analogy, but in the life science space, a lot of the innovation is outsourced to startups, and then it gets insourced into larger corporations through M&A once it's matured. And I think quantum and AI, especially on the software side, for quantum, so hardware is a different thing, but for the software, it's very much a space where a small, really competent team can get very far and do a lot of things that would be impossible in large organizations for all the other reasons we've discussed with risk and that, where you can really take something, and it's a different kind of capital you put behind that, venture capital that's more risk tolerant, but then you can really move things far. And I think we'll see, at least that's how I think of it right now, you will see more of the innovation happening outside of large corporations and getting insourced also outside of the life sciences, just simply because it's so different. What is possible now with AI tools for a small team, you used to need hundreds of engineers to do that. I have another mental picture, which is to design a building like this, probably you had a room of engineers sitting and bent and scrolling and scribbling, and they did models of arches to see if they would bend right. And today you build a building, you have one engineer and a CAD drawing on a computer, and that's enough. Like all the engineering science has been put into software. And we'll see a lot of that in businesses where it has been very human resource heavy, such as financial services and all this KYC and all of this that's been very manually driven, and suddenly now it'll become automated. So a lot of these manual processes, it seems like a quaint picture with the engineers, but we all have it in at least I do, in the back of our mind, those rooms filled with people, right? And that'll go away as well in a range of businesses in a not too distant future. But I think the step is going to be so large for large corporations that the innovation will have to happen outside and then be insourced once it's ready.
Yeah, but I think there's an important conversation. The 4.5 million SMEs in this country who are mainly not in tech, we need to have a good conversation about resilience, and resilience from a competitive perspective and also a talent perspective. And I think AI, if you think about cyber insurance, in my world, the penetration level in terms of buying in the SME community is, we don't know accurately, but it's well less than 20%. As in some industry sectors, less than 10. There's a great opportunity. So you travel that across into broader the broader AI universe, how we're using the opportunities, how we're actually thinking about the talent and the skills of the future. That's a massive resilience and competitive conversation that needs to be had.
I even wonder too if statistically cyber risk for them is greater than fire. Like when you think about how often it's happening now.
Normally what happens with an SME when they get attacked is they have no idea what to do and they just shut up shop. When a large organisation gets attacked, there's people who rally around and know how to get into the ecosystem.
Yes, and I've seen some first-hand where SMEs have tried to do their best and found that the services supplied to them weren't very good, which is not helpful.
I was going to say to your, to your point about the SMEs as well, we're probably an SME of about 180 people. And we did our Series A here with great local funds. And then we've done our B, C, and D with an American fund. And I think the speed of capital was a factor for sure in the B in particular. But really the secondary factor is the expertise of these funds. And in particular, not of the investment, she won't like me saying this, not the investor herself, but the ex-operators that this fund can bring in to help our business, particularly on a go-to-market side. I actually think this talent exists in the UK, but it's not assembled inside these funds like the Americans do very well. And that's like another area too, I think, where we could kind of drive that. And it's a European problem generally. I think the talent's here, it's just not deployed in a similar manner.
Yes, if I could make one difference to it, I think it would be to encourage people to come here. Because if people come here, investment decisions are made here, money flows to them, expertise builds up. I can dream on. I'm conscious of time. I'd like to one last topic, and then we'll start with you, Hans, as to sort of final thoughts. You're on the board of a company. You've listened to this. You've listened to other things. And you're sitting down with your CTO. What should you be focusing on?
Happy to start. I think the core bit is that what is America doing right when it comes to adoption of technology writ large, but particularly artificial intelligence, is the boards are very demanding and they're very discerning. They are looking for results that are, you could explain it. You could be talking about the introduction of a new factory, or you could be talking about technology. They're looking for not vanity metrics about adoption rates. They're looking for, is this driving revenue, and is this driving profitability of the business? Particularly in the UK, we have falling productivity for well over a decade now. What we need to be looking at is how is our CEO, how is our CTO, how are they working together and taking it seriously to ramp up productivity? The UK is largely a services-based economy. People shouldn't be looking for 20% improvement on admin tasks. They should be demanding a 10 times or a 50 times benefit. And if they're a good board, they'll get better at picking winners. They'll be better at selecting the CEOs, the CTOs. They'll be more opinionated about, particularly in the -1s and the -2s of the management team. And you should be. You're there to represent the shareholders, and if this is a transformational technology akin to crop rotation or the assembly line, then you should have an opinion on these things.
Chris, do you want to add to that?
I actually disagree in part because I think the upskilling of the workforce and those sort of marginal gains are not to be dismissed, particularly in scale organisations. The key issue is, are you figuring out how to use that time that you're giving back? And I think in the services economy, a critical mission issue is our talent. And if you look at your colleague engagement scores, you can quickly work out in different industries what the big issues are. For many of them in our sector, it's been the toil of a lack of modernisation. And so those who can get at some of that quickly can win in the talent war, and that's highly valuable in a services economy. But I don't also disagree that our clients are demanding hard ROI, based outcomes, and so we have to look at both of those.
Thank you. Okay.
I mean, to put a number on it, we're expected to drive 8% gross margin improvement in less than a year by applying AI against our own business processes. I don't think that's a demand a lot of British companies would make on a business.
Yeah. Some of us have got some opportunity there. Hans, final thoughts.
I think overall, this is an incredibly exciting space, and I think this has been a conversation that highlights that there is a truly remarkable value to be captured by deploying AI and eventually quantum across various industries, and I think we should all lean into that, and then manage the risk along the way. So there's sort of, you can capture 10x or 100x in productivity, but you don't need to risk the entire company in the process. So that sort of two-legged approach, I think, is important as we move forward in this exciting space.
Chris?
Look at some of the things that are out there today that are delivering real success for our customers and society more broadly. They're there. I mentioned one earlier, and I think that the whole issue of managing risk, we've got great frameworks. So I think it's an exciting opportunity. It's a compelling opportunity for the sector I'm in, for our competitiveness, and we need to embrace it. And I agree, just lean in, not be frightened, but put the risk frameworks around it.
Michael?
As I said earlier, right tool for the right job. And I think businesses need to understand where's the business advantage in these technologies for them, but also think about their market sector and where's the business advantage for somebody else. We did a survey with EY a couple of years ago thinking about quantum readiness. 97% of CEOs said that they needed to do something. It would be highly disruptive in their sector, in their business, and only 6% had a plan to do anything about it. So time to act.
I liked hearing most of all that quantum is here today. I want to hear more about that. No, I think the UK is a great place for a lot of these technologies to come together in a market that can experiment a lot. We don't have that geographical distribution. We have concentration in places like London. I'm very bullish on it. We moved our company from Singapore to here, right, to take advantage of several of the elements here. So I really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for the opportunity.
Can you just pause on that? So what was the most important things you were looking at?
In moving from Singapore to here?
For you?
I think, to be frank, principally talent. So, and to be close to, we provide a platform for the maritime industry, and this obviously is centered very much in Europe, Copenhagen, places like that, but also just our ability to hire engineers and custodians of the technology and flows that we're doing. There are a lot of characteristics that there used to be tax advantages too; those are gone. But I think it was difficult to hire top tier. I have to be careful. That may have changed in Singapore. Difficult to hire top tier talent at scale in Singapore.
Interesting. Nick?
So the UK has a lot going for it. We've got 3 of the top 10 universities for computer science. There is incredible talent in the space. That's why a quarter of Palantir's workforce is in London. There's about 1,000 people here. But that doesn't mean we're owed the success. It doesn't happen through osmosis. You have to take action. And I think that's the most important thing. If you don't want this to sort of be the success that sort of passes us by, you've got to reach out and grab it.
So I'm going to build on what Michael said. I think he said right tool for the right job. I'm going to say right expectations for the right tool. No one can afford to ignore AI or quantum, and I mean all quantum, not just quantum computing. But the expectations and the timelines are not the same. So it has to start with first principles. What are you trying to accomplish over what time frame? And pick the tool and the expectations based on that.
Yeah, and if I can add my own piece, it would be, there's been a period where I think experimentation was fine. And I think we've moved into another phase where you need to pick your targets. You need to be risk-led. I think there's several interesting conversations here about risk-led and trying to understand what it is you're trying to achieve and build your solution around it. But we've got to go to things which go right to the heart of what we do, which are going to make a real difference. And the other bits will just happen around the edge, but we shouldn't be experimenting. The time is now. So thank you, everyone. I hope everyone else enjoyed that. I certainly did. But big round of applause for a brilliant panel.